Have you ever wondered why life seems to shatter right before it transforms you? Why the moment you finally begin to awaken, everything you once depended on starts to fall apart? It is not chaos without reason, it is initiation, the secret alchemy of the soul demanding its own resurrection. When a woman is on the verge of her emotional rebirth, the universe does not whisper, it roars. It takes from her everything that is not aligned with her truth. The roles, the illusions, the comforting lies, all must die for something deeper to live. It begins subtly, almost invisibly. The laughter that once felt genuine now rings hollow. The places that once felt like home begin to feel like cages. The relationships she fought to preserve start to feel heavy, suffocating. And beneath the surface, a quiet rebellion begins, not against others, but against the part of herself that has been asleep. Her shadow, the repressed and forgotten self, starts to stir. It speaks not in words, but in discomfort, in restless dreams, and that aching sense of something more calling from within. She may mistake it for sadness or fatigue, but this is the soul's labor, contractions before birth. For so long, she has worn masks to be loved. The pleaser, who bends to be accepted. The caretaker, who sacrifices to feel needed. The strong one, who hides her pain behind composure. But these masks, once her armor, are now her prison. And so, life conspires to crack them open. Each disappointment, each heartbreak, each silence from someone she wished would stay, all are chisels breaking the stone around her heart. The Jungian path calls this descent into the unconscious, the confrontation with the shadow. It is the process through which the false self, the one shaped by approval, fear, and inherited expectations, begins to dissolve. The ego resists fiercely, clinging to its identity. It whispers, if I let go of who I've been, who will I be? Yet the deeper voice, the voice of the self, answers from the darkness, you will be free. But freedom does not come gently. It arrives through loss, through confusion, through the unbearable stillness of no longer knowing who you are. This is where most turn back. Yet the woman who dares to stay, to face the darkness without numbing it, to hold her pain without fleeing, she begins to see the truth, that her suffering was never punishment. It was instruction. Every rejection she endured was life's way of redirecting her back to herself. Every silence from someone she longed for was a mirror showing where she had abandoned her own voice. Every betrayal revealed the wound that still whispered, I am not enough. And as she begins to see, to truly see, she understands that she is not broken, she is being purified. The illusions that once held her captive, the belief that love must be earned, that worth must be proven, that peace depends on another's validation, begin to die one by one. And yet, rebirth always requires surrender. Like a serpent shedding its old skin, she must let go of everything that once defined her. The process feels cruel, as if life is taking rather than giving. But in truth, it is only stripping away what was never truly hers. The masks, the narratives, the borrowed dreams, they fall away so that her soul can breathe again. In this sacred unraveling, she meets her rawest self. The part that trembles, that grieves, that no longer wants to fight. The part that simply wants to rest in truth. This is where the alchemy happens. When the feminine stops running from her wounds and turns to face them, she no longer needs saving, she becomes her own savior. The energy that once went into pleasing, fixing, or proving now becomes power, quiet, grounded, magnetic power. It is in this crucible of darkness that her new self begins to form. Not the self built on what others expect, but the one born of authenticity. She learns that endings are not failures, they are sacred closures. That heartbreak is not weakness, it is the cracking open of the heart shell so the soul can emerge. She understands, perhaps for the first time, that nothing real can be taken from her. Only illusions can die. And as she begins to rise from the ashes of who she once was, her energy shifts. The woman who once sought validation now radiates presence. The one who used to chase love now attracts it effortlessly, for she no longer vibrates from lack. What she emanates now is wholeness, and wholeness is irresistible. This is the first whisper of emotional rebirth, the moment she stops identifying with her wounds and starts embodying her wisdom. The death she feared was never the end. It was the beginning of becoming. And so, from the ashes of the old self, the woman begins her quiet ascent, not a triumphant march, but a trembling rise, fragile and powerful all at once. The world around her does not yet see the change, but the universe already knows. Something sacred is shifting within her frequency. Her silence no longer means submission, it is discernment. Her solitude no longer carries loneliness, it carries sovereignty. As she sheds the skins of her former identities, a second sign begins to emerge, the collapse of emotional attachments that were built on illusion. She starts to see how much of her love was survival disguised as devotion. How many of her boundaries were merely unspoken hopes that someone would finally understand her without her needing to ask. This revelation cuts deep. It exposes every layer of her conditioning, the need to be chosen, the fear of being left, the belief that connection must come with sacrifice. Now, the psyche begins to reclaim its energy from the external world. What once felt like love begins to look like addiction. The relationships that once defined her now reveal their purpose, to awaken her to herself. Jung wrote that until the unconscious is made conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. And here, she sees it clearly, she was never cursed in love, she was repeating a pattern. Each person she clung to was a mirror of an unhealed part of her, the part that still longed for validation, still mistook attention for affection, still confused intensity with intimacy. She begins to pull back her projections. The man who ignored her becomes the symbol of her father's absence. The friend who used her becomes the reflection of her own inability to say no. The lover who adored her and then withdrew becomes the echo of her childhood, the dance between hope and abandonment. These realizations do not come gently, they burn. Yet, as every illusion burns away, she begins to see herself more clearly than ever before. The work of shadow integration is not beautiful. It is brutal honesty disguised as healing. It demands that she stop romanticizing pain, stop clinging to stories that make her the victim, stop worshiping suffering as proof of depth. It asks her to stand naked before her own patterns and say, I created this. Not from blame, but from awakening. Because once she claims her part in the pattern, she also claims her power to break it. In this second stage of rebirth, the feminine begins to detach emotionally, not in coldness, but in clarity. She no longer needs to chase what is not meant for her. She learns to observe her impulses with compassion, not to obey them. When someone triggers her, she pauses instead of reacting. She feels the old ache rise up, the urge to fix, to prove, to be enough, and she breathes through it. Each breath is a small revolution. Each pause is the rewiring of an ancient wound. And slowly, the energy that was once scattered begins to return to her. The energy she poured into relationships that drained her, into fantasies that disappointed her, into apologies that were never owed, all of it begins to flow back into her own center. It feels foreign at first. She has spent so long externalizing her worth that self-containment feels unnatural. But she is learning that emotional independence is not isolation, it is integrity. This is where the alchemy of transformation deepens. The woman who once sought love from others begins to cultivate it within herself. She becomes the mother to her own inner child, the one who once begged to be seen. She becomes the guardian of her own energy, the protector of her peace. This is not arrogance. This is sacred self-respect, the kind that does not shout, but emanates. In this silence, she begins to attract differently. Her presence shifts the room. People feel it but cannot explain it. They sense her groundedness, her absence of need. She no longer negotiates her worth through the lens of others. And so, those who come to feed off her light fall away, naturally, silently, as if dissolved by the vibration of her truth. What remains are connections that honor her growth, those rare souls who do not demand her dimness in exchange for love. She no longer feels the urge to explain her boundaries or justify her solitude. The feminine within her has risen from dependency to discernment. And through this detachment, a strange peace begins to bloom. Not the kind that comes from control, but the kind that comes from release. She no longer needs to predict outcomes or manipulate emotions. She understands that what is aligned cannot be lost, and what is lost was never truly aligned. In this realization, she begins to trust life again, not as a sequence of punishments, but as a mirror of her evolution. The storms no longer frighten her, they cleanse her. The endings no longer devastate her, they refine her. And in that calm acceptance, she feels the faint pulse of her new self, steady, sovereign, sacred. This is the second whisper of rebirth, when a woman no longer fears being alone, because she has finally come home to herself. From the stillness of that homecoming, something deeper begins to stir. It is not relief. It is revelation, the third sign of emotional rebirth, the confrontation with truth. Not the convenient truths that comfort, but the piercing ones that liberate. The kind of truth that dismantles everything she thought she knew about love, purpose, and self. In this stage, she begins to see that truth is not always kind, but it is always cleansing. The illusions she once clung to, that people would change if she loved them enough, that goodness would always be rewarded, that patience would be reciprocated, all begin to dissolve. Life reveals its impartial wisdom. It shows her that attachment to fantasy is the root of all suffering. And as this realization blooms in her awareness, she understands, her liberation lies not in controlling outcomes, but in surrendering to reality as it is. This surrender does not mean passivity. It is an act of immense strength, the kind that only arises when the ego finally bows to the soul. Jung called this process individuation, the sacred alignment between the conscious and unconscious, between who we think we are and who we were born to be. For the feminine, this is a journey from illusion to embodiment, from pleasing to presence. It is the death of the dream girl and the birth of the woman. She begins to see how often she betrayed her intuition in the name of hope. How many times she silenced her knowing because she feared being alone. The messages were always there, in the tightening of her stomach, in the subtle dissonance between words and actions, in the exhaustion that followed every attempt to make something work that was never meant to. She realizes now that the truth had never abandoned her, she had abandoned the truth. This recognition is not gentle. It breaks the heart open in the most exquisite way. It demands humility, the humility to admit that her suffering was not caused by life's cruelty, but by her resistance to what life was trying to show her. She had mistaken attachment for love, endurance for loyalty, silence for peace. And yet, beneath the grief of that recognition lies something luminous, freedom. Because when a woman chooses truth over fantasy, she steps into alignment with her highest self. The Stoics spoke of this kind of freedom, the acceptance of what is beyond control. We suffer more in imagination than in reality, Seneca wrote. The woman in rebirth begins to understand this not as philosophy, but as lived truth. She sees that most of her pain came not from what happened, but from the stories she told herself about what it meant. She was not unworthy because someone left. She was not unlovable because someone could not meet her depth. Their inability to stay was simply an invitation for her to do so. In this awareness, she stops seeking closure from others. She stops rereading messages, replaying conversations, searching for explanations. The story loses its grip because the energy of the past no longer defines her identity. She no longer needs answers, she needs alignment. She no longer seeks justice, she seeks peace. This is the sacred neutrality of an awakened heart. It is here that her relationship with emotion transforms. She no longer fears her anger, she listens to it. She no longer resists her sadness, she honors it. Every feeling becomes a messenger, not a mistake. Anger teaches her where she has been silent too long. Sadness shows her where she still longs to connect. Fear reminds her of her own desire to expand. Nothing is rejected anymore. Everything becomes a doorway into deeper awareness. In embracing her emotions without judgment, she dissolves the polarity of good and bad, of right and wrong. She steps into wholeness, the state Jung described as the union of opposites. She realizes that the light she sought was never outside her. It was hidden beneath the parts she was taught to hide. Her softness was not weakness, it was depth. Her sensitivity was not fragility, it was intuition. Her boundaries were not selfishness, they were sacred structure. And as she integrates these truths, something extraordinary happens. Her nervous system begins to regulate. The constant anxiety, the urge to control, the need to anticipate, they start to fade. The body, which once lived in survival mode, begins to trust again. She breathes more deeply. She speaks more slowly. She acts, not reacts. This is not just emotional healing, it is cellular transformation. She begins to embody grace, not as performance, but as essence. Her presence becomes medicine for others, not because she tries to heal them, but because she has healed herself. The energy that once leaked through people-pleasing now radiates through authenticity. She no longer needs to convince, to prove, or to explain. Her truth speaks through her being. And so, the woman who once lived divided, between her intuition and her conditioning, between her love and her fear, becomes whole again. This is the power of emotional rebirth, not to escape pain, but to be transfigured by it. To no longer chase meaning in what ended, but to embody meaning in what remains. This is the third whisper of rebirth, when truth replaces illusion and peace replaces control. The woman no longer fights the current of life, she flows with it. And in her surrender, she becomes unstoppable. As she moves deeper into her becoming, a fourth sign emerges, subtle yet profound, the resurrection of self-worth. Not the kind taught by the world, built on achievements or beauty or desirability, but the sacred kind that rises from within, the quiet knowing that she is enough, simply because she exists. In this stage of her rebirth, the woman no longer searches for her value in the reflection of others. She begins to sense that her worth has never been a currency to earn but an essence to remember. For years, she gave herself away in fragments, to be loved, to be seen, to be chosen. Now, she gathers those fragments back into her own hands. The energy she once scattered across other people's validation now pools within her, dense, magnetic, unshakable. This transformation does not arrive through praise or affirmation, it comes through loss, silence, and stillness. It comes when the applause fades, when the message isn't answered, when the relationship doesn't survive, and she discovers that she still stands. Her survival without external approval becomes the foundation of her new strength. From the Jungian perspective, this is the stage of integration, where the ego ceases to chase significance through the outer world and begins to serve the self. The woman recognizes that her worth cannot be constructed, only uncovered. Like gold buried under the debris of conditioning, her self-value was always there, waiting to be seen without distortion. The work of shadow integration has peeled away everything false, what remains is essence. She no longer asks, "Am I enough for him?" but rather, "Is this aligned with my truth?" It is a subtle shift, yet it alters everything. She stops performing to be chosen and begins choosing herself. She stops shrinking to be accepted and begins expanding to be authentic. The relationships that once drained her now feel incompatible with her peace, and she allows them to fade without guilt. She understands now that boundaries are not walls but the architecture of self-respect. As she honors her limits, she no longer fears being too much. She sees that what was once labeled too emotional, too intense, or too complicated was simply the depth of her consciousness, the mark of a soul attuned to truth. And so, she stops apologizing for her depth. She stops translating herself into versions that are easier to digest. Her voice becomes steady, her gaze unflinching. This is not hardness, it is clarity. The Stoics taught that no external event can harm the soul unless the soul consents. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The tranquility that comes when you stop caring what they say, or think, or do. Only what you do." The woman in rebirth understands this now not as detachment, but as alignment. She no longer measures her worth by what she receives, but by how faithfully she honors her own truth. When she looks back, she sees how much of her life was spent negotiating her own value. How often she accepted crumbs because she was afraid of hunger. But now she realizes, solitude is not starvation. It is the feast of the soul. In her own company, she finds nourishment that no external love could ever provide, the sweetness of self-acceptance, the serenity of being her own witness. This self-recognition changes her energy entirely. It moves differently, grounded, deliberate, unhurried. She no longer seeks attention, attention seeks her. Not because she tries, but because she has become luminous in her authenticity. The vibration of a woman who knows her worth is unmistakable. It bends reality around her. Opportunities appear. Respect deepens. Love becomes reciprocal, not extractive. Yet the most beautiful part of this stage is not what she attracts, but what she no longer tolerates. She no longer entertains half-love or conditional care. She no longer over-explains herself to those committed to misunderstanding her. She no longer participates in her own diminishment. There is no bitterness in this withdrawal, only peace. For she knows now that when something requires her to abandon herself, it is not love but bondage. In this reclamation of worth, her relationship with the masculine, both inner and outer, begins to transform. The wounded feminine once sought protection from others, the healed feminine now summons it from within. She integrates her inner masculine, the structure, the focus, the discernment, to serve her inner feminine's intuition and creativity. She no longer waits to be rescued, she has become her own anchor. And because she has balanced these energies within herself, the external masculine begins to mirror it. She no longer attracts chaos, because she no longer lives in chaos. She no longer calls on those who need saving, because she no longer confuses nurturing with sacrifice. The men who approach her now sense it instinctively. They cannot dominate her, for she is not seeking to be completed. She is whole. And in this wholeness, she moves with quiet power. Her presence becomes both invitation and boundary, soft enough to welcome, strong enough to protect. She lives not in reaction but in creation. She is no longer defined by her pain, but by her poise. This is the fourth whisper of rebirth, when a woman ceases to chase her worth and begins to embody it. When her very existence becomes an affirmation, she is, therefore she is worthy. And in that knowing, the world begins to bend toward her truth. And finally, from the stillness of self-worth, the fifth and final sign unfolds, the quiet dawn of peace. Not the fragile peace that depends on circumstance, but the unshakable calm that comes from radical inner alignment. It is here, in this sacred stillness, that emotional rebirth completes its circle. The woman who has walked through the fires of illusion, shadow, and surrender now stands in her essence, unmasked, unafraid, unbound. She no longer needs to be understood to feel whole, nor loved to feel worthy. She has discovered a truth so profound that it reorders her entire reality. Peace is not given, it is chosen. This peace does not mean that her life becomes free of conflict. The storms still come, but she no longer identifies with the storm. The chaos may swirl around her, but it does not enter her. There is a vastness within her now, a still ocean beneath the waves of life. What once would have shattered her now merely ripples the surface. This is what it means to have integrated the shadow. The darkness no longer controls her, because she has made it her ally. She understands now that wholeness is not the absence of pain but the ability to remain rooted within it. Her emotions still move through her, anger, sorrow, joy, love, but they no longer dictate her worth. She observes them like sacred visitors, each carrying wisdom, each reminding her of her humanity. She no longer fears the darkness, for she has seen what lives there, her own light. Jung called this individuation, the becoming of one's true self. It is the stage where the soul no longer seeks validation from the collective but listens to the quiet authority of the inner voice. The woman who has been reborn begins to live not reactively but intentionally. Every word she speaks, every choice she makes, comes from presence. She no longer moves to prove, but to express. And this expression carries a frequency that cannot be faked, authenticity. People feel it in her silence, in her eyes, in the way she no longer flinches when misunderstood. She radiates a soft strength, the kind that makes no demand yet commands respect. Her energy no longer leaks through seeking, it expands through being. In this space of serenity, she forgives, not to condone, but to release. She forgives her younger self for not knowing better, her past lovers for reflecting her wounds, her parents for giving what they could from their own limitations. Forgiveness becomes her liberation. She no longer needs the past to be different for her heart to be free. And in that forgiveness, she reclaims her life force. The energy once spent reliving stories of betrayal or loss now returns to her creativity, her purpose, her joy. She begins to create again, not from longing, but from overflow. Her art, her words, her very presence become extensions of her healed self. The world around her starts to shift because her inner world has changed. This is the moment when she understands that everything external was always a mirror. The people who hurt her, the loves that ended, the silences that hollowed her, all were invitations to awaken. Life was never against her, it was for her evolution. The pain that once seemed senseless now glows with divine order. She sees it clearly now, nothing was wasted. Every heartbreak carved space for deeper love. Every ending carved space for new beginnings. In this final awakening, the feminine no longer fights for her power, she embodies it. Her power is no longer the armor of survival, it is the expression of presence. She does not chase. She does not beg. She does not prove. She simply is. The masculine within her stands guard, her boundaries, her discernment, her logic, while the feminine within her flows freely, her intuition, her empathy, her creativity. Together, they move in harmony, birthing balance within her being. She has become her own sanctuary, her own home, her own divine union. Now, when love returns, and it will, it finds her whole, not waiting to be completed. Her relationships become mirrors of reciprocity, not transactions of need. She meets others from fullness, not from fear. She loves without losing herself. She gives without depletion. She receives without guilt. And as she walks through the world, there is a quiet majesty about her, a woman who has died many small deaths and been reborn into her truth. Her presence is not loud, yet it changes the atmosphere. She does not demand attention, yet she holds it effortlessly. She has become the embodiment of grace through fire. And in this final moment of rebirth, she realizes something simple yet profound: she no longer desires to be chosen. She chooses where to give her energy, whom to trust, what to nurture. Her power lies not in pursuit, but in discernment. Because the woman who knows her worth does not chase, she chooses.